Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 29th of August, 2019. It's time to talk about the MixPre II series of recorders. When I woke up this morning, I did not anticipate this. Did not expect to see a MixPre II as soon as we have. And so it was a little bit of a surprise to me, but I've received a ton of questions over the last 12 hours, and so I thought it would be a good time to talk about what we know so far about the new MixPre II series. The questions and emails ranged from, wow, I'm so excited, I can't believe it. I was getting ready to buy a MixPre-10T. It looks like the price is now $400 less. Am I missing something? To, oh my gosh, I just bought a MixPre III. I'm doomed. My life is over. There's no reason to go on living. Anyway, that's just joking. But really, what I wanted to do is kind of talk about the new feature set here, and kind of talk about what's different. I think a question that comes up over and over again is, if I'm a MixPre owner already, do I need to upgrade? What do I get if I do upgrade? Or what am I missing if I don't upgrade? So those are all valid questions, and we'll talk about that a little bit here as well. So let me just, hi, Andre. It's good to see you here. Yes, what a surprise indeed. Let me just share my screen here, and we will look at a few things here. All right, so first of all, the website for Sound Devices, if you want to get all of the details, of course, you can do that over at the Sound Devices website. They have plenty of information. But let me just go to a summary that I found actually over on the Gotham Sound website. For those not familiar with Gotham Sound, Gotham Sound is it caters to production sound mixers in both Atlanta and New York, and they have they do a great job. By the way, they have a YouTube channel. They're very active and doing lots of stuff that help soundies. So I think they've got some great information. So they put together some information here that I think is useful. So first of all, here are the new features that are available in all of the different models. First of all, you can record up to 32-bit float wave files with up to 142 decibels of dynamic range. And we'll talk about that a little bit more detail, just to really get to the details of what that means in practical terms. All three of the MixPre II series have an internal timecode generator. So whereas before it was only the 10T that had an internal timecode generator, now the 3 and the 6 also have an internal timecode generator. All three can now record up to 192 kilohertz. Before, the MixPre III topped out at 96 kilohertz, and it was the 6 and 10 that could do 192. Now all three of them can do 192. We now have adjustable limiters, and mind you, these are still analog limiters as well as digital output limiters, but these are now adjustable, so you can adjust some of the parameters. So for example, I need to look into what that involves exactly, but my guess is that you can adjust the threshold to some extent, and you may be able to adjust the ratio. Don't know if you can adjust the attack and release, but we'll look at that as well. Previously, only the MixPre-10T had the auto copy to USB drive feature. So there is a USB-A port and a USB-C port on the MixPre series. And starting with the MixPre-10T, they added a function that allowed you to essentially plug in a USB drive, and then as you were doing recordings, it was also making a copy over to the USB thumb drive. And so the nice thing about that is it was basically giving you a backup, some redundancy, because all three of the original MixPres just had a single SD card slot. So, Timothy just said, really bummed because I just purchased my MixPre-10T. Stand by. We may have good news for you. It may not be as bad as you think. So that's a nice new feature. So the MixPre-10T had that. Now the MixPre III 2, the MixPre 6.2, and the MixPre 10.2 all have that. And now there is a 10-second pre-roll buffer. That is to say, when you press the record button, it actually starts recording 10 seconds before you press that record button. So that's a really nice new feature as well. It looks like it still has the same Cashmere preamps, so the sound quality from a purely analog standpoint and in terms of the amount of gain, which is 76 decibels of gain, looks like are the same. And then let's see, if we look here, there's a little chart here where they give you the different specs on all three of the new MixPres. The one change I did see, or a few changes I did see, number one, the MixPre II now has combination XLR TRS inputs. So before on the original, it was just XLR. As mentioned before, well, let's see. Likewise, timecode, they all have timecode generators built in. The 3 and the 6 still use a 3.5 millimeter stereo mini jack for the timecode in and out, but the MixPre-10 II still uses the BNC output and is also capable of word clock. And it says, according to this external linear timecode, I can't imagine, I could be wrong, but I would assume that the 3 and 6 can also take timecode from an external source, but I'm not positive because that's how they used to work. So in any case, we'll take a close look there. All right. So there's a kind of a rundown of the changes in terms of new features. So let's talk a little bit more about this 32-bit float recording. I think that's an important one. Over on the Sound Devices website, and I'll leave the links for these in the description after we're done with the session here. But we have a couple things. Number one, there's a sample 32-bit float versus its same recording at 24-bit fixed, just so you can see what the WAV files look like and how they react in different digital audio workstation apps. So here, for example, they have this little animated GIF that shows with a 32-bit file, I can actually exceed 0 dB full scale and still pull that back, whereas with a 24-bit file, it gets clipped permanently. So you can go download those files if you want to look at them in your digital audio workstation of choice. You can do that and get a sense for what they look and sound like. That can be instructive. That's very similar to what we did in our Zoom F6 preview video several months ago. And that was, I think, one of the big things that had people super, super excited about the F6. And in some ways, I would actually argue that this almost seems like a reaction to that in a little way, in some ways. Interestingly, the MixPre series, from my understanding and talking with Paul Isaacs, from the start had the ability to process internally. Its converter was actually doing its math in 32-bit, but it was then writing to a 24-bit file. But it looks like now they've expanded that, so it now can write to 32-bit float file. So what does a 32-bit float file do for us? I will also put a link to this page so you can go read in detail what it does. But let me just read the summary here for you really quickly. The MixPre II models introduce the ability to record to 32-bit floating point wave files for ultra-high dynamic range recording. 32-bit float is the ideal recording format. The primary benefit of these files is their ability to record signals exceeding 0 dB full scale. There is, in fact, so much headroom that from a fidelity standpoint, it doesn't matter where gains are set while recording. Audio levels in the 32-bit float wave file can be adjusted up or down after recording with most major DAW software and with no added noise or distortion. To understand the nuts and bolts, continue reading, is basically what it says. Okay, so there's that, and then here's a summary here at the end. Let me just read starting at this paragraph here. Each audio sample for 32-bit float file consumes 32 bits of space on a hard disk or memory, and for a 48 kilohertz sampling rate, this means, does a little math there, are needed for 32-bit. So there's a 33% more storage space compared to 24-bit files. So there is a cost in terms of storage space, but the nice thing is that with audio, the files are not that huge from the start, so a 33% increase may be worth the cost. But what this does allow you to do is the dynamic range captured goes from 144 dB up to essentially infinite, over 1500 decibels. But more importantly, audio signals above 0 dB full scale are preserved in the file, rendering clipped audio a thing of the past. Recording 32-bit audio files along with high-performance analog and digital electronics can take advantage of its massive dynamic range, offer sound designers and sound mixers a new way to record audio. This is especially useful for applications where very loud, unexpected sounds can be captured without the use of limiters. The trade-off for using 32-bit float files is larger file sizes compared to 24-bit. So there's kind of the summary. from the Sound Devices perspective on what's changing here with 32-bit and in these new recorders, the MixPre II series. So let's talk about this a little bit more. I'm getting some reactions here. Oh, the other thing I wanted to show here too is if you look at the product catalog, and let's just pull that up. Actually, is this it? This is it. Okay. So this is the whole product catalog. Of course, we have the Scorpio, the 600 series, and we now have the MixPre II series. You will see that the rest of the MixPre series are not represented here. So what that tells me, or what I would assume, is that they have stopped making the separate music versions of the MixPre, which I think is probably from a product perspective a really good idea. I think that was really kind of confusing for everybody. Oh, and of course, along with that, one thing we didn't talk about is the price. The price has actually come down a bit on some of them. I can't remember the price of the MixPre 3 originally. It's now the MixPre 3.2 is $649. MixPre 6.2 is $849. I think that used to be $899, at least at launch of the original MixPre 6. And the MixPre 10T has actually come down significantly to $1399. It used to be $1799, so that's come down $400. So a big change there. My perspective is that the big changes, the 192 kilohertz, when I record sound effects, I usually go 96 kilohertz, and that can be useful. But I've never really found a use for 192. Perhaps someone can correct me if I'm, if they have a perspective that differs from that, and you do have a use for 192 kilohertz recording, that's cool. The adjustable limiters is kind of an interesting thing, so that's interesting. The auto copy to USB drive, I think, is a really nice step forward. So this is where I feel like Zoom has kind of been making some steps little by little as well in this area as well. So one of the advantages that Zoom had in terms of the F4 and the F8 was that they had two SD card slots, so they had some redundancy built in. That was only available, I guess, roughly equivalent capabilities on the MixPre 10T. The MixPre 3 and 6 just had a single SD card slot and no ability to record to a USB drive. So I feel like they're kind of responding to that in some respects with this new auto copy to USB drive on all three models. So that's good. They now have this 10-second pre-roll buffer on all three. That's a nice little step forward. The internal timecode generator on all three models is definitely a step forward as well. So now, really, I think that the MixPre, at least in those particular areas, are definitely competing, obviously, with the Zoom F series. So that's a nice step forward, because I remember when I put together my video, this is probably 2 years ago or a year and a half ago at least, comparing the MixPre series and the Zoom F4 and F8. There were really kind of some big trade-offs. So if redundancy was really important to you, that's where the Zoom had the advantage. If you needed the less expensive recorder and you wanted linear timecode or a timecode generator built into the device, Zoom F4 had an advantage there. One area where the MixPre still has an advantage, though, is that all of the MixPre series can work with an app, and the app is available both on iOS and on Android. So that is an area where the MixPre has an advantage, potentially, depending on your use cases, over the Zoom F series. So that's still in place. And now, when Zoom announced the Zoom F6, I think I saw a lot of comments on my preview video about, oh, I wonder if I should sell my MixPre and get a Zoom F6. Well, that question changes a little bit. And actually, Paul Isaacs and I had been in communication. Paul Isaacs is one of the product designers over at Sound Devices. He and I had been in contact talking about that particular issue, I guess, of 32-bit recording and wide dynamic range. And I was getting ready to do some testing and produce a video where we showed how much you could move or change the amplitude in a MixPre recording. If you say, for example, set the gain really, really, really low and you wanted to bring it way up in post, leave yourself lots and lots of headroom in case, maybe you were at an air show recording and you just didn't know how loud things were going to get when those, a jet aircraft flew by, and just do some testing there. And Paul's perspective was you could easily increase it by 50 dB and still have a good usable recording. on the original MixPre, and I think now we're seeing that's probably going to be the case here too. Obviously, we need to get our hands on it and test it some, but it's looking like they're addressing that as well. So there's some thoughts on that. So let's go to some questions here. We've got a lot of activity. Oh, there is one thing that if Sound Devices, or Paul, if you are watching this, one thing to consider, I did see on the MixPre-10 2 page, it did say you could power via USB from your computer. I think that's probably an error. I think that's probably a copywriting error where that was pulled over from the MixPre 3 and 6 page. Unless we're going to be surprised. That would be kind of neat. I don't know that the USB-C spec could supply enough power for the MixPre 10T, or the MixPre 10 2, I should say. So that's something to check there. But I'm doubtful that that is the case, just so if anyone had that question. All right. So some questions. Timothy was really bummed because, let's see, let's go ahead and add this. Roman was lucky because you didn't buy it this morning. Timothy is feeling kind of bummed because you just purchased the MixPre 10T. If you just purchased it, you might be able to return it and get on the list for the 10.2. I'm not positive on that, but something to consider if you'd like to look into that. Roman, you were one that emailed me today. Thanks for doing that. He was actually considering purchasing the 10T this morning and then saw the announcement. And I think asked a valid question that I think we should probably bring up here. I don't know the answer to it. I think I know the answer to it, but I'm not positive. And that is, will they drop the price of the 10T or the 10.2 from the 10T by $400? Did they take some features out? Based on the specs, it doesn't look like they did, but that's a fair question. Based on all my reading of the specs, it looks like everything is still there. So it doesn't look like it has taken a step back. If I had to guess, in my day job, I am a product manager and work on developing new products. If I had to guess, this is purely speculation. I have no inside information of Sound Devices. If I had to guess, they probably were able to lower the price, especially on the 10T, because they recouped a lot of their original research and development costs with the original pricing of the MixPre. And so now, they don't have that burden, if you will, anymore. And so they can sell them at slightly lower prices. So that's a total guess, no idea. But it also puts them in a better position as far as competing with Zoom as well. So some interesting things. So Andre, are any of these features to be included in the original MixPres? I don't know the answer to that either. I'm thinking at this point that I'd like to invite Paul to come on the show and we can talk about a lot of these things. I haven't had a chance to contact him yet, and I'm sure he's very busy with a new product launch. But that's a fair question. I don't know if any of these are software only. I would assume not, but I don't know that for sure. It sounds like, well, I mean, even if you look at the Sound Devices page for the MixPre, one of the things they say in their marketing materials are very clear about. Where was it? This basically, they said it's all the same features of the original MixPre with more advanced hardware. So I think most of these, if I had to guess, are actually hardware based. So I don't know if they'll make it into into any firmware updates for the original MixPre. So Kevin, the basic filmmaker, thanks for joining us again. All right, Roman says, so with 32-bit file size will be 30% larger with huge dynamic range. Why is Sound Devices still using 32-bit SD cards? Well, let's just take a look at that. I'm pulling up, let me just pull up, I'll share my screen here. Let me just pull up the specs page here for the 10.2. Recording. You can use up to a 512 gigabyte SDXC card. So I believe you can actually go larger, and it is now using the exFAT file system. So that's good to know. So you can use SD, SDXC, or SDHC. So I think, yeah, Roman, I think you can go much larger cards. So that's good news. Okay. Scott Slaughterbeck, I suppose the originals are not going to be sold. I imagine that if any of the resellers have some of the old stock, they may still sell it, but it doesn't look like it's represented on the product page at Sound Devices, so it looks like probably not still being sold. Here's another interesting thing from Bangs. Interesting thing is music plugin is now $49. Yeah, so it looks like they don't have the music versions, but the plugin is now $49 instead of $99. So I think that's a really good move in a lot of ways. And again, probably the price is down because, again, probably a lot of the research and development costs have already been covered by the initial sales, and so they can reduce that price some. Um, so yeah, I think that's really good news because there was so much confusion about should I get the MixPre-10M or the MixPre-10T, and I think it was a really good choice on their part to just make it one hardware device. And if you want the music capabilities, $49 and you're on your way. So good choice there. And Scott, it must be a reaction. Competition improves the breed, as they say in Detroit. I fully agree. And then we talked about the 32-bit floating point. If you missed that, definitely come on back. Bangs, any word on RF64 file saves on the MixPre II as opposed to the Scorpio? There's no mention here of RF64, so it looks like it's just saving it to 32-bit wave from what I can tell. I don't know, and I have to go back and look at the RF64 spec. I don't know if that's the same. I can't remember if that's the same thing. I apologize. If somebody knows, love to hear what you know about that. Peter Sinclair, I see the encoder still on the side of the MixPre-10T2. If I have any complaint about the MixPre series, it is that darn headphone / menu encoder knob on the side of the unit. I really, Paul Isaacs, I think I know the answer to this. I would love to see that move to the front of the unit. Change the form factor, do whatever you need to do, charge me more money. I want that on the front of the unit. It'd be so much easier to use. But nevertheless, we can still get by. If I had to guess, that is a massive R&D and retooling investment that they'd have to make to do that. So manufacturing retooling. So I don't expect we'll see that anytime soon. I think they could do this and bring them out at lower prices because they didn't have to do a whole ton of retooling in terms of the overall manufacturing. So that's my guess if I had to guess what's going on there. But yeah, Peter, I agree. That would be the same thing. So Scott, okay, it was $899 for the original MixPre 6. So yeah, it looks like the price has come down just a touch, $50. Next up from Roman, I hope Sound Devices will fix the SD card's capability, at least 64 gigabytes. I think, unless I'm misunderstanding, Roman, I think they have. And that's the same thing that Bang saw over on the website as well. Okay, yeah, looks like we got that sorted out. And Greg, let's see. Yeah, it looks like it may have been the B&H spec page. So definitely go to the Sound Devices for the specs. Good point from Greg. Wave Agent, the app that's available from Sound Devices, which you can typically use to split up polywave files and break out individual channels and kind of change timecode values and things of that nature, does not currently support 32-bit float. So that is a bit of a bummer. I am hopeful that they will update that. Okay. Clayton asked a question on the MixPre 10 or the MixPre 2. Can you set limiters just on the mix tracks and leave the other tracks with no limiter? That remains to be seen, and I don't know if the documentation. There are some downloads here. That would be something to check in the user guide. Great question, Clayton. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but we can dig into the user guide and check that out. I won't do it here while we're on the call, but those docs are available, it looks like. And they may be rough still. I don't know. I haven't looked at it yet, but it looks like you can make some changes there. Let's just look at the page on the limiters. Page 18. I'm just going to quickly take a scan of it and see what we can learn from the scan. You guys may want to go download that as well. All right, limiters. You can toggle limiters on or off. Let's see, fully adjustable limiter parameters giving control over ratio, release, and threshold. Interesting. So you can change the release and threshold and ratio. They can be fine-tuned for dialogue, Foley, nature recording, and even live instruments. You go to menu system limiters. The following options are available. It doesn't look like it's per channel or mix. It looks like it's generally assigned, but I can't tell. Based on the documentation, that's what it looks like. So good question, Clayton. We'd have to dig into that, but it looks like from the docs, maybe not. All right. Robert has a question. I want to sync two cameras recording 1080p 60. I can't find timecode dongles that do 60. I set them to 30. Would they be wrong together? Music bed, no audio. Yeah, that should work fine if you're doing a multiple, and make sure you're setting it correctly as far as drop frame or non-drop frame. I believe that'll work fine. Anyone correct me down below if you disagree with that, but I think that, yes, 60 should be able to work with timecode set to 30. Thomas asked a question. Came in late. Has the MixPre II price been announced? It has been, and the price is $649 US. The price of the MixPre II is $849 US, and the MixPre-10 II is $1399 US. So the prices have dropped a bit, especially on the MixPre-10. Additionally, interestingly, Roman says that the limiters only work at 24-bit. Of course, they're not relevant at 32-bit, but interesting. Alejandro, what did I miss? Well, definitely have a review here. We talked about the 32-bit in particular, but we talked about the overall differences. How do I mic 10 casts in a game of Mafia with only the sound device is 633? Well, you can do 6 with the 633, assuming that you have wireless on some of them. So that would be your line inputs. If you're using wireless, it has a line output. So that's one option to get 3 there, plus the 3 mic preamps. That gets you 6. If you're going to do any more than that, you're going to need to put a mixer in front of the 633 to get more. So that would be my thought on that one. Clayton, I heard that sound devices limiters are great on voices. However, I heard it's not great on other things such as instruments. Would it be a good idea to record 32-bit float with no limiters? Yes. In fact, it looks like the limiters may not be even available when you're recording 32-bit. So, and they would, in theory at least, probably in practice be irrelevant at that point. So, all right, Everesa, greetings from Paraguay. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here. Greg Palmer, I don't understand the need for both limiters and float. I think it's an either or. You're doing one or the other. Limiters would be something you use when you're recording 24-bit, and 32-bit float, you wouldn't need limiters. So. From Clayton, what software do you use to browse sound effects? One that shows the waveforms so you can fast forward to the sound effects portion. Depends on what I'm doing. I am usually using Audition or Fairlight when I'm doing mixing and actually including sound effects. So usually the sound effects that I'm using are just the sound effects, so it's not too hard to find the sound effects portion. So those are some thoughts on that one. But Fairlight actually is pretty nice on that front. If you haven't used that already, definitely worth a look. As I understand now, there are 2 variants to use limiters in 24-bit or 32-bit. Good question. I don't know. I didn't see anything specifically clarifying that. Bangs asked, is any program you suggest to combine broadcast polywave chunks to a single RF64? I think that would, I don't. I have not worked with RF64 at all, really, yet, just because I haven't had anything that could record in RF64. I don't know if most of the DAWs can actually export to RF64. So it's a good question. I'll need to go take a closer look. But yes, definitely a hint to the sound devices developers. We'd love to see Wave Agent updated for sure. Have sound devices announced a release date when the MixPre 3, 6, and 10.2 versions. They are supposed to be shipping now. I contacted, I pre-ordered mine from DVE Store because I'm out closer to the West Coast here in the United States, and they're based in Washington. I'm able to get things from them quite quickly. They do not have a copy yet, but it looks like they're going to receive their first ones. It sounds like here in the next week or so. So they're supposed to start shipping here very, very shortly. Why are limiters not relevant on 32-bit float? If you get analog clipping in the preamp, you've clipped. As long as the AD converter can handle the full range of the preamp, then 2432 are the same. Um, I don't know exactly how the entire architecture works in the new MixPre II. If you're recording at 32-bit, like I said, I don't really know what's happening at the analog level when you do that. I assume you still have a gain trim setting. And I think that you're probably right. There is a point at which you could clip. So I'm not really sure how that works. I think the idea, though, at a practical level is that when you are recording now, you can leave yourself a lot more headroom without any worry of pulling that up in post. So you can leave a good, just a ton of headroom, 30, 40 dB of headroom, and not have to worry as much about pulling it up in post. So that would be my thinking. I don't know what happens. Generally analog preamplifiers will saturate before they clip. But it's a good question you have. I really don't know the answer to that yet. Again, hands-on time is where we'll get the answers to that to see how it really responds. Joe Choi, where do you get songs and effects? Great question. So my songs I get at MusicBed, and just in full disclosure, I'm actually a MusicBed ambassador, although I haven't been especially outspoken about that. But on my main channel, I use the MusicBed music tracks for my intro and outro music. So I've been working with them. I like their service. Their service is unique from the standpoint that the artists retain copyright on the works, and they have a fairly sophisticated system that prevents people who have licensed use of those tracks from getting copyright infringement issues. So for example, on YouTube, they have basically a bot that will quickly check when you first upload your video and essentially say, okay, that's our track. This person is licensed to use it. No copyright infringement, not a problem. And I think it's good that the artists, a lot of times musicians are, I'm a little bit sensitive to this topic because my wife is a musician. Musicians aren't necessarily remunerated or paid as fairly as they should be in a lot of circumstances. So especially with, all these different stock music services, I think it's only fair that they retain the copyright. So that's my perspective on it. Other people may have different perspectives, but that's why I work specifically with MusicBed as opposed to some of the other stock music agencies. All right, Mark Owens. Only just got email from YouTube. I managed to get 2 Sennheiser MKE2s for 165 Australian. Wow, that's a great deal. And a Sennheiser MKE1 for $200. Do you like these mics? I'm only doing indie shoots. Well, yeah, the MKE2 in particular. I don't know. MKE1 I'm not familiar with. MKE2 definitely. If you got 2 of those for 165 Australian, if they're in good working order, that was a steal. So, and that's a great lavalier microphone. So congratulations, Mark. Yeah, I think that's going to be great. I would have no issues at all. That was a really good find. Alejandro, that's crazy quick. Did Sound Devices ever announce at NAB the 2 versions of the MixPre series? No, they just announced them this morning, so it's brand new. And then Thomas, regarding 24 linear 32-bit float, thanks. Glad it's not just me. For MixPre and F6, seems that the analog preamp's performance is key. Looking forward to real testing. I think that's absolutely true. And this is where we're going to start to see perhaps a difference between the MixPre and the Zoom F series, and how well, because now in some respects we're removing, well, we're also going to see the performance of the analog to digital converters, but we're also going to potentially see the performance of the analog preamp stage as well. Now, all of this it's applicable in practice, but also remember this is in theory in a lot of our cases. You have to have a microphone that can handle the dynamic ranges that we're talking about here. And I think basically what's happening is now with these recorders and their architecture, we're at a point now where it's not going to be the recorder and the preamp that's going to stand in your way of capturing dynamic range. It's going to be the microphones for the most part. And there are a lot of even really good microphones that don't exceed 110, 120 dB of dynamic range. And then, of course, you're dealing with noise floor as well, so or self noise. So it's really going to be the microphones that are going to be your limiting factor. So I want to talk a little bit just before we move on here. Especially for those that already own a MixPre and are feeling kind of bummed out that, oh no, I just bought, a MixPre and now suddenly I am, like all the money that I spent is now out, I now have this outdated product. I wouldn't look at it that way at all. I would say this. First of all, let me say this. I pre-ordered the MixPre-10 II because I'm an educator. I can continue using the MixPre-10T very happily. I'm getting fantastic results with it. I'm not experiencing any of the problems necessarily that these solve. So for me, it doesn't make a huge difference, especially if you have a 10T. Now, I think those that are going to gain the most are the MixPre III II and the MixPre 6.2. Those have some additional new features that are genuinely very helpful at a practical level. And I'm not trying to discount 32-bit float. I think, that's cool. That's good. We will eventually get microphones perhaps that have wider dynamic ranges and we can take advantage of this. And, if you really botch up setting your gain trim at some point, maybe this will save you. So that's cool. But I think the internal time code for the MixPre 3 and 6, the auto copy to USB drive and the 10-second pre-roll buffer, those are huge. Those are huge, very practical, useful features. And so I think that's the biggest place where there's a difference between the original MixPre 3 and the MixPre 3 II, and likewise the 6 and the 6.2. So to kind of put your mind at ease, ask yourself, have you ever run into one of these issues? Have you found yourself in a situation where you were on a MixPre 3 and you needed to record 192 kilohertz? I'm going to guess there aren't a lot of people that are feeling really limited by the sample rates available on their original MixPre 3. Did you have an SD card fail at some point? Or are you concerned about that? Or are you working on jobs where you really need to have a backup? Well, then probably it may make sense to look into upgrading to the new version. Have you missed a take before because you didn't have enough pre-roll buffer? Maybe you need to look at, maybe this is a case where there's this feature available that could make a difference for you. Adjustable limiters. Are you recording something other than dialogue? And so you want to be able to adjust those limiters. Or you want to be able to, anyway, you can see my point here. If you're getting, the thing to keep in mind and keep in perspective here, I think Sound Devices would be delighted if everyone upgraded their MixPre that already owns one. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that your MixPre 3, your original MixPre 3, makes great recordings, and it will continue to make great recordings. Be very realistic about whether or not you face any of the problems that the new version solves. And I challenge most people that say, well, I need this 32-bit recording. Maybe. We have yet to see how it works in the real world, but just keep everything in perspective. Don't lose your mind over this. It's we're on today new products are being released all the time. Of course, those of you that also operate camera and have to manage cameras, you know what that world is like. And in the audio world, we're a little bit insulated from that until recently, at least, where there weren't nearly as many options. And so it wasn't like you bought a recorder and the next day a new one came out very often. So anyway, just some thoughts there to keep in mind. Alejandra says, it's so crazy how Zoom has yet to release their F6 recorder. This is really going to set them back. Well, let me give you some perspective on that as well. I talked to Samuel Green over at Zoom USA. And for those that aren't aware, evidently the ship date has been pushed back to October because they ran into some issues with one of the physical components in the Zoom F6 build. So they basically had to go back and redesign that part, retool, and now they're ramping up production again. So just to give some perspective of why that's not available yet. I'm going to go out on a limb and say something here as well. I've had my hands on a Zoom F6. It's a neat little recorder. Don't anybody take this the wrong way. And it has more inputs than the MixPre 6. Um, and I think it's going to be roughly in the same price range as the MixPre 6. So it has 6 XLR inputs. Those are XLR only, incidentally, not XLR TRS. And the MixPre 6 has 4 XLR inputs, so it does have that advantage. But its form factor is really kind of funky. It has a really, the front plate is about, it's kind of smallish. It's oriented a little differently than the MixPre. Ergonomically, I found the F6 pretty difficult to use. Like if I was actually going to be operating sound for a production day, I would much rather use a MixPre 6 than a Zoom F6. I really think that Zoom envisioned the F6 as a specialty device. And Samuel told me this at NAB, kind of off the camera. He said, well, this is really kind of, we see this as a specialty device and an opportunity to test our new 32-bit dual analog to digital converter tech. But the specialty idea was being able to plant that recorder somewhere and walk away from it, start recording and walk away and not have to worry about whether or not you set the gain trim correctly for what's going to happen. So he gave the example of a sound mixer that was doing some sort of recording in a helicopter. They basically had to wire up the helicopter, start recording, walk away, and they were not able to go up in that helicopter for the shoot. So that was, and I think really, I'm 99% sure. If I'm guessing here. I don't know. I don't have any inside information, but I'm 99% sure that Zoom will add this dual analog to digital 32-bit float recording to their next generation Zoom F series recorder. So they're just testing it out in the F6. So at this point, I would definitely, like if I'm looking for a general purpose recorder mixer in this less than $1,500 range, I would definitely be much more likely to look at the MixPre series or the Zoom F4 or Zoom F8. And at this point, with all the features we're seeing on the MixPre II, my personal preference is definitely for the MixPre II series, regardless of, depending on which size you need. But I have the MixPre 10, I pre-ordered the MixPre 10 II. I currently have the MixPre 10T, and that serves as my backup mixer for when I do location sound jobs. And in some cases, actually fairly recently, I had a shoot where I had a relatively high input count, a lot of microphones, a lot of wireless out there, and so the MixPre 10T was my mixer that day. So I didn't bring I actually brought my MixPre 6, my 633, but I used my MixPre 10T just because it had that high input count that I could use. So there is what is hopefully some perspective there. Why would they fix that on the MixPre 10? I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're talking about. I didn't catch your comment early enough. Sorry about that. Back to bangs. Is battery power for the 3.6 similar to the 2? It looks like power is the same. So you can power the MixPre 3.6 and the MixPre 3, the 2 version, via USB-C, or it kind of the original MixPre 3 and 6 came with this funky cable that had 2 USB-A connectors for your computer and 1 USB-C on the other end for the MixPre. And if you got the right kind of outputs on your computer, you could power it from your computer. And you could also power it if you brought your own USB-C to USB-C cable. And you had the right kind of USB-C port on your computer, you could power it with just that single cable. It looks like the same applies to the MixPre II, but again, I'll have to see. We'll have to see how that goes when it comes out. Okay. Scott says, timecode is the biggest improvement for me for the MixPre 6, and I'm using Pluralize or just using a slate. I agree. I think that is a huge, huge benefit for the 3 and the 6, is now having its own internal timecode generator. So really nice step forward there. And that kind of takes away, that makes the decision, I think, a little easier if you're trying to choose between the Zoom F series and the MixPre series. Now they're on even field there, it looks like. So that's an interesting step forward. For studio work, a high sensitivity mic can have the gain stage so low that it can approximate some of the benefits of float on the older units. I agree. I think you're right. If you're using a really good preamp and converter with some of the older MixPre and other sound devices units, you get a lot of those things there. So Oh, DJ, just got my MixPre 10T this morning. You could probably return it if you wanted to get the 10 too. I'm guessing from most retailers, hopefully. So I hope that would work out for you. Am I right? Back to Thomas. I am right seeing the time code out for the 3 and the 6 from only the headphone jacks. Fine to jam, but not continuous? Ooh, that's a good question. On the originals, they had a separate, it wasn't shared with the headphone jack. It was the auxiliary port that was shared. I can't imagine it's the headphone jack that's being shared, but let's go look just to be certain. Let's go back to the product catalog, MixPre 3. Yeah, it looks like it's still the same. I would guess, Thomas, it looks like it's sharing that aux mic in 3.5 millimeter jack. So you could, and this is yet to be determined, whether or not you can feed timecode continuously from an external timecode generator into the MixPre 3 or 6. That I don't know the answer to. So that remains to be seen, but it is not shared with the headphone jack. It's the auxiliary mic in jack that it's sharing there. All right, Carlos, I hope they at least provide the USB transfer in a firmware upgrade. Oh, the USB copy capability? That would be nice. I don't know if that's possible or not. There could be hardware limitations, but maybe not. Art by Pale Horse, just got my MixPre 3. Thanks for the advice. You bet. You just got it from B&H. B&H should take it back. I work with B&H as well. I'm pretty sure, 99% sure they'll take that back. Ian says, I have a MixPre D. I use an iPhone as a recorder. Outside of timecode, is it worth trading up to the new Sound Devices items? I would ask yourself which particular problems you're trying to address. If you are happy with what you're getting today, then no. If there are problems that you're running into that you'd like to address, there's a very good chance that the answer is yes. So I think you'd probably want to kind of go through that analysis for your own use cases and see where you land. That would be, I think, the best approach there. Looking forward to the class on your website. You bet. We are definitely going to be upgrading the MixPre course to include the MixPre II series as well. So any new features there we'll cover as well. Any comments on the 12x4 mixer on the 10.2? Will they add this to the 10T? I think, well, I guess I need to understand better what you're asking there. The remix feature is already available on the MixPre 10T. It's just a firmware update, and in fact, if you just got it, it should already be on there. So again, I guess I would probably try to return that if you can, and get on the list for the 10.2. But in any case, that hopefully that answers your question. You can also use control surfaces with all of them, I believe. That uses the USB-A port. What I don't know is the Scorpio has an interesting feature where the USB-A port, you can connect it to a USB hub and connect multiple devices. There's no talk of that with the MixPre series, even the new version, the new 2, Mark II. So I don't know if that's going to be possible here. So for example, if you wanted to connect a keyboard to enter metadata and a control surface using a USB hub, I don't know if that's possible or not on the MixPre 2, but that was one question that kind of came across my mind that hopefully we can, maybe we can connect with Paul Isaacs and get a clarity on that. Carlos, I doubt Sound Devices save money on the USB port. The 10T has a USB port. There's a high chance it's the same. That would be really cool. Oh, well, the 10T already does this. The 10T already does the USB copy. That's already been on there from the start. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but that's already on there. So that was actually when it was introduced with the introduction of the USB 10T. All right. Hopefully that was a worthwhile discussion for you. For those of you, again, that are looking forward to this, we will, or want to learn more, I definitely have one on pre-order, and we'll get a look at that and put it to some practical use and see how things pan out in terms of real-world usage. Looking forward to doing that. Thanks for everybody for joining, and we will talk to you again soon. Take care, everybody.